Let's talk about hydrophobic and hydrophilic. And I think I briefly talked about this again. All my lectures are available on my YouTube channel. So if you need a refresher more in detail, you can go to those. I believe it's in my chemistry lectures. So then hydro refers to water in general. So this useful root word / prefix. Now philia refers to life, or not life, but like, love, and affinity. So if you have someone who's a bibliophile, they love books. Or if you have someone who's a biophile, they love life, they love living things. So hydrophilic means compounds and chemicals that can dissolve and mix with water. So it likes to associate with water. So when you have a hydrophilic compound, so all these people like water, right? So hydrophilic compounds, they like water, they like dissolving in water, they like being in water. So they freely diffuse throughout water and associate with water. Now, what is this? Ooh, this is a spider, right? So what's the term for fear of spiders? Oh yeah, let's not talk about that. Yeah, but it does involve that same root words, and yeah, unfortunately, yes, yes, it involves that same PHYL root word. Okay, so then this is arachnophobia if you have a skip fear of spiders, right? So arachno, like arachnid and arachne in Greek mythology, that means spider. So phobia is a fear, right? So spider fear. And if you're like me, if you don't like snakes, thankfully we don't have, it's not like Guam where we don't have snakes. But then what we have here is ophidiophobia. That's the term for fear of snakes. Ophidio referring to snake, and then fear is phobia. I love Guam and Saipan, but that's the part I don't like. Alright, so acrophobia. So what we have here is heights, and then we have a phobia. So what we have here is phobia refers to fear. So opposite of PHYL. So when you have a hydrophobic compound, these are water-fearing compounds. Yeah, so we have phobos referring to the Greek word, it's a Greek root word meaning fear. So what we have here with hydrophobic, these are water-fearing compounds. So that means they don't, compared to our hydrophilic compounds that like to dissolve and swim around in water, these hate water. They hate associating with water. So when we're talking about that in terms of biochemistry and chemistry, it's an inability of a chemical to dissolve in water. So what we have here, so it's insoluble, and that's what we call insoluble. All right, so classic example, you can do this at home. Yeah, I love that relaxing music, but it's just cooking oil into water. If you can mix it up, you can shake it up as much as you want. But what happens eventually? Well, the oil starts to separate from the water, right? So water, or like things like oils and fats, they are typically hydrophobic. They don't like mixing in freely with water. You can shake it up, you can suspend it, but eventually it'll separate unless you add something else. So this is what you'll see eventually. So when we talk about something that is lipid or fat soluble, that means it likes to dissolve in, versus dissolving in water, it likes to dissolve in fat. So hydrophobic compounds, they tend, slight differences in definitions, but in general, hydrophobic compounds tend to be lipid and fat soluble. So if you had to dissolve them in either oil or water, they would be more, hydrophobic compounds would be more likely to dissolve in this hydrophobic part right here. So ability to dissolve, when to say something is fat soluble, it refers to some sort of ability of a compound or chemical to dissolve in lipids and fats versus water. So in general, there are some interesting compounds that can dissolve into both water and oils, but in generally, when something's very hydrophobic, it tends to be more soluble and able to dissolve in lipids and fats versus water. Now, remember from last lecture, we talked about 3 general classes of hormones. So we have our monoamines. These are hormones that are made from a single amino acid. But when you have multiple amino acids linked via peptide bonds, those are polypeptides. So this is what we have with our peptide hormones. And then we have our steroid hormones, and these are all made from cholesterol. Now, how does this relate to hydrophobic and hydrophilic? Well, monoamines and peptides, these tend to be hydrophilic. Pretty much like, yeah, so all of these are hydrophilic, and then steroids, because they're derived from cholesterol, cholesterol is a lipid, it is a fat. Therefore, these tend to be hydrophobic. So how does that affect things? Well, It affects signaling. So remember that your body is like, well, depending if you're male or female and your body composition, but water makes up a big component of your body and is most of your extracellular fluids, such as your interstitial fluid and the plasma, which is the liquid portion of your blood. Now, the extracellular environment, so this is the environment surrounding and bathing your cells. It's mostly water. So whether a hormone is hydrophilic or hydrophobic determines how its solubility in water and its ability to be transported throughout the extracellular environment. So here we have a hormone, and here we have the plasma membrane. So this hormone is going to bind to a protein receptor, and when you have these receptors for water-soluble hormones such as monoamines or those short peptides or longer polypeptides, these receptors tend to be on the outside of the cell. Why? Because you have this water here. So if it's a water-soluble hormone, well, it has an easier time just floating around in this extracellular environment, binding to some sort of receptor on the outside of a cell. Now, okay, so peptide and monoamine hormones are typically hydrophilic. There are some like weird exceptions, but in general, these are hydrophilic. So, since they're hydrophilic, their receptors are typically on the outer surface of a plasma membrane. So again, they're facing the outside of a cell because the outside of a cell is mostly water-based. And this is the Martini version. I think that it's also in your slides as well. Do I expect you to know all of these steps? Well, I think this is like maybe the most you should know. Don't study in more detail past this at this point. Maybe for the 300 level class, you might have to go through the whole G protein coupled receptors. I think Bio 265 or 275, they also cover that. I mean, at least when I took it decades ago. But I know a long time ago, when dinosaurs roamed the earth. But yes, I mean, you will learn it at some point if you're a bio major, you'll definitely know it at one point. If you go to grad school, med school, you'll definitely know it at some point. But for now, just keep it simple. Or this is actually, okay, you don't have to take notes at this part, but this is kind of what you have to know at the upperclassmen or advanced or graduate level. Or actually, this is more just like, it's still undergraduate level at this point. But what happens here more specifically, well, here's a G protein, and I think in your book it just represents it as a monolithic, just one protein. Your G protein actually has multiple parts, and this is what happens with hormone signaling with this type of protein receptor. We call it G protein coupled receptors, sometimes called GPRs. These are a big family of protein receptors. So here we have a hormone binding to a protein receptor, this G protein coupled receptor. And so it binds to here, and that causes a change in it. That's why I kind of use that kind of like ignition. It causes a change in the shape of the receptor, and that causes this to allow these G proteins to bind. And then these G proteins change shape, and they exchange the chemical GDP for GTP, and this causes it to break apart. And when this breaks apart, this alpha subunit breaks apart, then it goes to adenylyl cyclase or adenylate cyclase, same name. So there are different names for the same thing. Then it converts ATP to cyclic AMP, and then cyclic AMP binds to protein kinase A. When the cyclic AMP binds to the regulatory subunits of protein kinase A, that causes it to release the catalytic subunits of protein kinase A, and this phosphorylates other proteins. Now, again, these two slides I do not expect you to know at this level. But if you're going into like pharmacology or any of the advanced biology stuff, you will have to know this at one point. Now, if you thought that was complicated, this is what you have to kind of know when you're going to the doctorate and PhD level. So here we have all these G protein coupled receptors, and if you're going into a PhD program at one point, you'll probably have to learn multiple pathways here. So it gets even more complicated. This is the protein kinase A. I just showed you this part right here. But what we have here is all these G protein coupled receptors and other protein receptors. So it gets a lot more complicated. So if you're studying this, you're studying way beyond the scope of this class. Good for you, but you don't need this for the tests at this level. Again, cell signaling is very, very complicated. That's why I kind of choose my targets very carefully for this class. Now, what I want you to know hormones can bind to protein receptors on the outside of the cell, and that causes all these changes. So what are the changes? These are the changes, and this is only a snapshot of the changes that can happen in response to a hormone binding to a receptor. All right, so then this is what I want you to focus on. So hormone, you have your protein receptors on the, for water-soluble hormones, the protein receptors tend to face the outside. Hormone binds to receptor, that activates G proteins. That's what I want you to know at this level. So this is what G proteins, and these G proteins are what set off that cascade, that chain reaction of all those intracellular changes. So this is what we call signal transduction, that very complicated diagram I showed in the previous slide. That is one example of signal transduction. There are many different pathways and different routes of signal transduction. That was just one of them. So then the thing is that, so this is what I'm getting at here. Hormonal activation of these receptors may result in things like cyclic AMP production and release of intracellular or increases in intracellular calcium concentrations. And actually, you might see me use this a lot. I use this abbreviation a lot. If you haven't had chemistry, whenever I have something in brackets, that's referring to the concentration of something. So this is talking about the concentration of calcium ions. So what happens when I use this kind of symbolic notation? I'm just saying you have an increase in the concentration of calcium ions inside the cell.